Post-Sovieticum as a new order in Central and Eastern Europe in the program of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations. One of the lesser known yet highly interesting political and intellectual projects created in the emigre communities of Central and Eastern Europe in the 1980s was the activity of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations. This organization was established in June 1982 by Father Franciszek Blachnicki in Karlsberg in the Federal Republic of Germany. Today, Franciszek Blachnicki is known as the founder of the Light Life movement. However, his political and geopolitical activity during the final years of his life is less remembered. It was connected with a program for the liberation of nations of Central and Eastern Europe from the communist system. The Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations brought together representatives of the nations of Central and Eastern Europe remaining under the domination of the Soviet Union. Apart from Polish people, the community included Bulgarians, Croatians, Czechs, Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Germans, Russians, Romanians, Serbs, Slovaks, Slovenians, Ukrainians, and Hungarians. We see the aim of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations was not limited only supporting resistance against communism. The organization also tried to create a vision of the future political order after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this sense, the movement was ahead of its time. It is worth remembering that during the first half of the 1980s, the Soviet Union still appeared to be a superpower. Europe remained ruled by the post-Yalta order. Many Western politicians believed that the division of Europe was practically unchangeable. There were fears that any attempt to dismantle the communist system could lead either to a world war or to chaos in Central and Eastern Europe. In practice, this meant accepting a situation in which the states of Central and Eastern Europe remained under Moscow's domination. Peace based on the Yalta Order was treated as a guarantee of stability, even if it meant the lack of sovereignty for entire nations. Against this background, the activity of Franciszek Blachnicki was exceptionally brave. Blachnicki believed that lasting peace could not be based on the enslavement of nations. He was sure that the communist system was not permanent and that preparation should be made for the era after its collapse. A very important concept in his reflections was post-Sovieticum. This term was already used in the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations as early as 1983. The post-Sovieticum program postulate organized meetings of working groups devoted of future political and economic order in Central and Eastern Europe. The intention was that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the nations of the region would be prepared for independent action. Franciszek Blachnicki said that otherwise others would once again decide about us without us. Blachnicki even planned to publish a special series of political science notebooks called Post-Sovieticum. Beginning in 1983, the journal Truth Cross Liberation included a separate section called Post-Sovieticum. The very use of this term in the first half of the 1980s was something exceptional at a time when most Western politicians regarded the Soviet Union as a permanent element of the world order. The Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations was already speaking about a post-Soviet era. Franciszek Blachnicki was aware that the Post-Sovieticum program was extremely bold. One of his speeches in 1985 was even entitled Post-Sovieticum, Utopia or Task. He stressed that Post-Sovieticum was not utopia, it was a task. The nations of Central and Eastern Europe should prepare themselves for life after communism. They should create new elites, new forms of cooperation, and new vision of international order. Blachnicki rejected the idea that the Yalta order was permanent and untouchable. He believed that a system based on the domination of an empire over other nations could neither be durable nor just. At the same time, he was aware of how risky such activity was. He knew that he was challenging not only communist power, but also the entire political security system based on the logic of Pax Sovietica. In Western Europe, it was very often believed that maintaining peace required expansion of the division of Europe and leaving the nations of Central and Eastern Europe within the Soviet sphere of influence. There were fears that the collapse of communism might lead to war, border conflicts, or even disintegration of the entire European order. Franciszek Blachnicki thought differently. He was sure lasting peace could only be built upon the foundation of nations' freedom, social solidarity, and respect for human rights. The founder of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations opposed passive expectation of the slow collapse of the Soviet Empire. He wrote directly that post-Sovieticum could not mean merely passive hope for the spontaneous disintegration of the system. He stressed that active involvement of the nations of Central and Eastern Europe was necessary, together with conscious preparation for the future political and moral order after communism. Franciszek Blachnicki did not limit himself criticizing communism. He believed that societies had to be prepared for the responsible use of freedom after regaining independence. An important element of the activity of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations was also the creation of space for free discussion within communist countries. Using the experience of the Light Life movement, Franciszek Blachnicki underlined the importance of small groups. He believed that in such communities people could speak freely and openly and build the attitude of social responsibility. A recording studio was established in Carlsberg at the International Center of the Light Life Movement, where meetings and conferences were organized within the framework of the study of social liberation. Recordings from these meetings were preserved on cassette tapes and secretly transferred to Poland. The journal Truth Cross Liberation and books published by the Maximilian Publishing House in Carlsberg were also smuggled into communist countries. At a time when communists controlled the media in the Eastern Bloc states, small groups create the possibility for the exchange of opinions. As examples of such communities, Franciszek Blachnicki points to domestic church cycles in Poland and neighborhood groups in Slovakia. The program of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations also asks difficult questions about the relation between nations, borders, and historical truth. An interesting example were the Polish-Ukrainian meetings organized in Carlsberg. Participants discussed not only the struggle against communism, but also future relations between the nations of the region after regaining independence. It was argued that the border between Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus should in the future resemble the borders between the states of Western Europe. This was extremely bold vision for the first half of the 1980s. The community of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations therefore tried to formulate a vision of the future political, social, and moral order after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. They discussed questions about the reunification of Germany, future borders, and the political system of Central and Eastern Europe states. An important topic in the post-Sovieticum program were also human rights. Blachnicki believed that human rights should become one of the foundation of the future European order after the fall of communism. At the same time, he drew attention to the danger of politically abusing this concept. He wrote that human rights could be used as propaganda by different political groups. He wrote against manipulation of the slogan of human rights in pursuit of particular political interests. Therefore, he underlined the need for vigilance and control at the international level. This was an extremely modern reflection. It anticipated many later debates concerning democratic standards, international security, and the interpretation of human rights in contemporary Europe. The activity and program of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations were seen by the communist authorities as a serious ideological and political threat to the Soviet system and to the status remaining within the Soviet sphere of influence. Many agents were placed around Franciszek Blachnicki. Today it is beyond all doubt that Jolanta Gortalczyk, codenamed Panna, who was president of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations, was an agent. Her husband, Andrzej Gontarczyk, codenamed Jon, who was responsible for the activity of the Maximilianum printing house in Carlsberg, was also an agent. The preparation of marches organized by the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations was also supervised by a communist agent. It must therefore be concluded that from around 1985, the activity of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations was increasingly paralyzed and disintegrated by intelligence operations. Agent, content, disinformation campaigns, and restricted the possibilities for the development of the community around Franciszek Blachnicki. The culmination of this action was the death of Franciszek Blachnicki on 27 February 1987. Even after Franciszek Blachnicki's death, agents Jon and Panna remained in Carlsberg for some time and continued activities directed against the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations. The aim was to disintegrate and to disinform. Consequently, when the process of the collapse of the communist system in Central and Eastern Europe began at the end of the 1980s, the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations did not have any significant influence on this process. As a result of communist intelligence operations, the post-Sovieticum program was not continuation after 1989. The Light Life movement, which had implemented the program developed by Franciszek Blachnicki, also did not adopt the post-Sovieticum program. One reason for this was the disinformation campaign conducted around the person Franciszek Blachnicki. False information was spread suggesting that during the final years of his life he had become seriously ill and detached from reality. Franciszek Blachnicki was poisoned on 27 February 1987, at the very moment when he was to receive $2 million from American Protestants for his activities. He was killed because his work was a threat not only to the communist authorities in Poland, but also to all communist systems in Central and Eastern Europe. Today, the memory of Franciszek Blachnicki's activity remains very much alive in Poland. One expression of this is the resolution of the Senate of the Republic of Poland establishing the year 2027 as the year of Father Franciszek Blachnicki. The resolution was adopted unanimously. This demonstrates that the activity of Franciszek Blachnicki is today seen as an important part of the Polish heritage of freedom. The ideas of Franciszek Blachnicki and the community of the Christian Service for the Liberation of Nations remain an important testimony. Already in the 1980s, there were circles thinking about Central and Eastern Europe not only in terms of the struggle against communism, but also in terms of the future post-Soviet order. Thank you.